Ask any group of RPG fans to point to the exact moment the Final Fantasy franchise truly manifested its modern identity, and they will almost universally point to Final Fantasy IV. And on paper it makes sense. Final Fantasy IV gave us Cecil, a dark knight seeking redemption. It gave us the active time battle system, a legendary OST by Uematsu himself, and a dramatic, linear narrative that proved video games is not only this,
the most exciting game you will ever see on your TV set,
but also can tell its own story. But there is a massive flaw in that consensus, in my opinion. If you take a look and really look at the actual DNA of this franchise, Final Fantasy IV didn't create a template for the future. Final Fantasy IV gave you a fixed party with locked-in rigid classes. It was a playable screenplay where your only job was to press attack and watch the narrative unfold. The true definitive turning point, the moment where the series decoupled itself from standard fantasy tropes and found its mechanical and spiritual soul, happened 1 year later. It happened when this guy, Bart's Closer, who you probably never ever seen before, sat on a log, watched a meteor crash into the earth, and stumbled accidentally into a system of absolute gameplay, freedom, and a great story. This is the case for Final Fantasy V. The game that built the modern franchise, revolutionized the JRPG genre, and was promptly forgotten by us. To understand why Final Fantasy V is so violently overshadowed, we first have to understand the tragedy of its release. In 1992, Final Fantasy V dropped in Japan to absolute critical acclaim and also massive commercial success, moving over 2 million copies on the Super Famicom. But over in America, Square localized Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II. Then they looked at Final Fantasy V, looked at the Western market, and made the infamous executive decision. They thought it was too hard for us. They thought you were dumb. Dumb Westernoids. Fucking low IQ pigs. Square genuinely believed Western gamers would be completely overwhelmed by deep customization and high mechanical difficulty. Instead of translating Final Fantasy V, they scrambled to develop a completely stripped down, simplified spin-off called Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Because of this, an entire generation of Western gamers grew up with a massive 7-year black hole in their Final Fantasy education. When they finally did get an official English translation and release of Final Fantasy V in 1999 as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology on the PlayStation, it was already too late. By 1999, the world had already experienced the cinematic 3D revolution of Final Fantasy VII and VIII, and as you know, it hit like a fucking truck. To the mainstream Western audience, Final Fantasy V didn't look like a classic blueprint, it looked like an obsolete, dated pixel game which you can just throw away. It was sandwiched chronologically between the narrative highs of Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI, and contextually buried under the shadow of Final Fantasy VII. It never stood a chance. This shift highlights the exact moments the series shifted from standard RPG design to true Final Fantasy identity, the middle child and transition between the classic Final Fantasy era and the golden era of the PS1. While Final Fantasy III technically invented the job system, it was a primitive prototype. In Final Fantasy III, a mage was a mage. If you changed jobs, your old skills vanished. Final Fantasy V introduced the concept of skill transference. When you level up a job in Final Fantasy V, you don't just gain raw stats, you unlock sub-abilities that can be equipped onto any other job in the game. This minor tweak exploded the tactical landscape into infinite possibilities. The game didn't just allow you to break its systems, it actively encouraged it. Bosses motivated you to experiment with different combinations and grind the different skills of each job. There are so many combinations you can play through the game. If you think this perspective is just revisionist history from modern fans, you only have to look at Square in 1992. During the post-development and release interviews for Final Fantasy IV, the development team received a surprising amount of critical feedback from Japanese players. Final Fantasy IV was too linear, and because your party setup was entirely dictated by the script, replaying the game felt completely boring. Director Sakaguchi and lead designer Ito took this criticism really personal. They decided that for the next entry they were going to completely put the linear model down. With double the memory capacity, the team didn't use the extra space just to make longer cinematic cutscenes. Sakaguchi and Kitase worked in relentless, competitive rolling shifts, passing code back and forth to see who could create the most dynamic gameplay scenarios. Years later, when Kitase asked Sakaguchi what actually defined a true Final Fantasy game, Sakaguchi pointed directly back to the corporate culture established during the creation of Final Fantasy V. He stated that as long as that iconic blue text window is on the screen, a developer should be allowed to do whatever wild, unproven thing they want. Final Fantasy V wasn't just another sequel, it was creative independence. Independence that makes real games real games. There are so many games I could point to where creative freedom just makes absolute great games, even masterpieces. The ultimate test of any game's greatness is its legacy, and the genetic footprint of Final Fantasy V is absolutely massive. When Hiroyuki Ito and Yasumi Matsuno sat down to create Final Fantasy Tactics, they didn't look at the framework of Final Fantasy IV. They took the exact job framework of Final Fantasy V, added a 3D grid, and created one of the most celebrated tactical RPGs of all time. When the developers of Final Fantasy X built the massive free-form sphere grid, they were chasing the ghost of Final Fantasy V's cross-class skill customization. It is a testament how influential this game was, and it's not even an overstatement, but this game truly feels fresh, even if it was from an older time. Every player has a different party system in their playthroughs. Of course, now there are many different solid threads that homogenized every playthrough in every guide. But if you were to play this blindly and just experiment yourself, it turns really into a simple JRPG sandbox. It's so much fun. Many critics point to the story of Final Fantasy V as its weakest link, often calling it a cartoon compared to the high-stakes political tragedy of Final Fantasy VI or the melodrama of Final Fantasy IV. But exactly that campy, light-hearted tone wasn't a flaw, it was an intentional stylistic choice. Final Fantasy V captures something pure that the modern entries often combine under the weight of their own serious cinematic ambitions. The pure joy of an adventure. It gave us Gilgamesh, it gave us XIII, and also one of the coolest scenes, in my opinion. Final Fantasy IV showed us that video games could tell a moving story, but Final Fantasy V did something far more important. It defined how a Final Fantasy game should feel to play. The pure joy of an adventure. It represents the exact moment the franchise realized that its ultimate strength wasn't beautiful linearity. It was giving the player a massive sandbox of systems and saying, go crazy, have fun, build something broken, and at the same time, explore and witness the greatest stories. It is the mechanical anchor of the entire franchise, and it's time we finally gave Final Fantasy V its flowers.